Welcome to Exploding Brooklyn, newspaper accounts of Brooklyn's industrial history on Newtown Creek, a podcast from Tripping Balls Through History. Penny Bridge used to cross Newtown Creek at the end of Meeker Avenue and connect to Queens, where now is the southernmost tip of Calvary Cemetery. The Alsop farm was located on the Queens side of Newtown Creek on the eastern side of the Penny Bridge and road. When the Alsop farm was sold in 1845, the newspaper advertisement stated it as being at the Penny Bridge on the road leading from Bushwick to Newtown. The cost for these 115 acres in 1845 was $21,460, paid by St. Patrick's Cathedral to be the beginning of Calvary Cemetery, the westernmost section of the cemetery, separated from the other by the confluence of the Long Island Expressway and the BQE nowadays. Calvary Cemetery includes the original Alsop family plot to this day. On the west side of the Penny Bridge and Road in Queens was Toner's Penny Bridge Hotel. An 1892 article about replacing the Penny Bridge with a new Meeker Avenue Bridge in the same place describes that the Meeker Avenue Bridge necessitates taking up 25 feet of the southern portion of Toner's Hotel. The hotel now faces east and will have to be moved on a line with the Long Island Railroad, the necessary ground for which will be given by the Calvary Cemetery authorities, from whom Mr. Toner has only a lease of the ground on which stands his hotel. Queens County objected strenuously to the building of the new bridge on the ground that the present bridge had only been built 4 or 5 years ago and cost $75,000, it is still in good condition. The Penny Bridge had burned in 1882 in the Locust Hill Oil Works fire, so perhaps it had been 10 years? In any case, Queens County was overruled by higher authorities, the Secretary of War, nowadays called the Secretary of Defense. The Times-Union tells us that the Secretary of War had received several complaints from the owners of tugboats which ply up and down the creek, having in tow large schooners of heavy tonnage and mud scows. The tugboat captains complained of the insufficiency of the width of the draws, which are only 40 feet. The protests constantly sent to the Secretary of War had the desired effect. It was not just Queens that objected to the new bridge. Michael Toner, owner of Toner's Penny Hotel, sued, complaining of encroachments on his property in consequence of the building of the Meeker Avenue Bridge. It was stated by Mr. Toner's counsel that the excavations for the building of the retaining wall of the bridge, 20 feet deep, are now within 5 feet of his house, and unless this is stopped, his cellar will be undermined and his house destroyed. 3 weeks later, the Times-Union reported that Supreme Court Judge Cullen continued the preliminary injunctions restraining boards of supervisors of Kings and Queens counties and the contractors from continuing the construction of a temporary bridge over Newtown Creek at Meeker Avenue in front of Michael Toner's hotel. The bridge was built, and 8 months after filing suit, Toner was awarded damages of $561.50 to be paid by Queens County for having to move his hotel. The 1894 disaster on the Penny Bridge was well covered in the newspapers, and 20 years after this incident, the bridge was replaced. Saturday, January 13, 1894, the Chicago Daily Tribune. Down with a bridge. Crowd of Long Island toilers dropped into the water. 7 are known to be missing and 3 are injured. The unfortunates dropped into 10 feet of icy water. Many heroic means of rescue. The place Laurel Hill. the scene of other disasters. Structure was of a temporary nature. General news from New York, January 12. Into the chilly waters of Newtown Creek, 100 men and boys, without warning, were plunged late this afternoon by the breaking of a flimsy wooden bridge. In the struggle for their lives that followed, no one can now tell how many of them were swept away to death by the tide. The first accounts were that many of them were missing, but most of these had been accounted for at midnight, and many a family that had first feared lest it be fatherless or brotherless rejoiced in the safety of those that had been near to death. That there are others unaccounted for is certain, but how many or just who they are may not be known for a day or two, until a complete count can be made of all who could have been upon the ill-fated structure when its weak timbers gave way and dropped its human burden into the stream. By stress of the hard times, the factory in which they were employed was working on only three-quarter time, and many were out and away to their homes some hours before the accident occurred. Had they been working on full time, they would have been let out at the same hour with the men and boys in neighboring factories, and the death toll would have been appalling. The draw had been opened for a couple of tugs, and one of them had become fastened in the opening. The people, anxious to be first in crossing when the draw closed, crowded upon the stationary span and overtaxed its strength. The accident caused great excitement in the neighborhood, and many who were waiting on the shore to get across lost their self-control to such an extent as not to be able to assist those struggling in the water for their lives. The unfortunate people in most instances were left to scramble out as best they could. In 10 feet of water. The tide was slow and had just turned, but there was still a depth of 10 feet of water, and in this the struggling mass of humanity was thrown amid the wreckage of the fragile structure. Some of the cool ones on the shore threw pieces of wood to serve as buoys to those struggling in the water. At last the ropes with which the fallen span had once been swung were cut away and used in dragging the unfortunates out of the stream. It was several minutes before any of them were taken ashore. Only a few of them were able to help themselves by swimming, and these were dragged back and down by those who could not. The fortunate coming of 2 tugboats was all that served to avert a greater disaster. These were the J.W. Cloud and the Conklin. Many of those in the water supported themselves by the floating timbers of the fallen bridge, keeping themselves afloat until they were dragged on board the tugboats. Miss Annie Foley, 20 years old, whose father keeps a roadhouse on the Brooklyn shore of the bridge, heard the cry of those in the water, and looking from a window saw them struggling for their lives. She picked up a carving knife, ran into the backyard, cut off part of a clothesline, and then ran to the shore. She threw one end of the line into the water and tied the other end to a pile. 4 men climbed up this rope and were saved by this girl's determination. Her father rescued 3 men. His son Michael rescued 2. The work of rescue. John Lane of Penny Bridge pulled 6 men out of the water, and John Quinn, who was at the end of the draw when it fell, jumped to the solid part of the bridge in the middle of the stream, and then climbed down to a pile, to a crosspiece near the surface of the water, from which perch he assisted several men from the creek. George Loyal of No. 459 Graham Avenue, Williamsburg, pushed his way through the crowd on the draw, and had just reached the end of it when it fell. His leg was caught between 2 pieces of timber and badly bruised, but he clung to the solid part, cleared his leg, and was saved. Despite his injury, he rescued 3 men. The tugboat J.W. Cloud, which was coming up the stream, did good work. Its crew rescued about 50, and the Conklin saved almost as many more. Several small boats put out from either shore and helped persons from the icy waters. From Brooklyn, there were summoned the ambulances of St. Mary's, St. Catherine's, the homeopathic, and the Eastern District hospitals. The surgeons did good work, furnishing stimulants to those who were chilled or shocked. Only 2 were so bad as to need further attention. An ambulance went from St. John's Hospital in Long Island City, and the surgeons who went with it found plenty of work in attending the 60 persons who had been taken into Toner's Hotel. The worst injured was Timothy Gannon, number 108 Eckford Street, Greenpoint, a spike having been driven through his left ankle in the wreck. The accident happened at a place notorious as the scene of many disasters. It is just outside of Long Island City, at the southwestern corner of Calvary Cemetery, near where the accident occurred on the Long Island Railroad last August, when many lives were lost in a railroad collision. Who is to blame? The firm of Dean and Westbrook of number 136 Liberty Street, this city, were the builders of the temporary bridge, and upon them may fall the blame, if upon anyone, unless it is to be upon the unfortunates themselves who were plunged into the creek in the wreck. It is true they had been warned not to crowd in too great numbers upon the structure, but no means were provided to prevent them doing so, other than the presence of a man at each shore end to keep them back. If there was a crowd in rush hours, as there was this afternoon, all that the single man could do was to stand back and let it have its way. That this is what he did, he himself admits. The men and boys crowded past him, and when 100 of them had jammed themselves upon the narrow span, its timbers were not strong enough to hold the accumulated weight, and down the structure went. The structure that collapsed was made of wood and was built as a footbridge for the use of pedestrians while the new iron bridge is being built. The bridge that was removed was known as Penny Bridge and was on the thoroughfare leading from Greenpoint to Williamsburg. The structure in course of erection is to be known as the Meeker Avenue Bridge. The draw of the temporary bridge was worked on the same principle as the one used at Clark Street, Chicago, a few years ago, while the new bridge across the river was being built, and was such a structure as the temporary bridge across the south branch of the Chicago River at South Halsted Street. One end of the draw rested on a pontoon and was operated by means of a windlass. Saturday, January 13, 1894, the New York Times. Into icy Newtown Creek. 75 men on a bridge that broke in two. Collapse of the temporary wooden structure connecting Bradley Avenue at Laurel Hill with Meeker Avenue, Brooklyn, was crowded with workmen in a hurry to get home, kept waiting by an open draw, several missing, 3 severely injured. Long Island City, Long Island, January 12. By the giving way of a temporary wooden bridge across Newtown Creek, connecting Bradley Avenue, Laurel Hill with Meeker Avenue, Brooklyn, at least 75 men were thrown into the icy waters of the creek a few minutes after 6 o'clock this evening. The water was at the time about 9 feet deep. Few boats were near. The men struggled in the water, while those on shore looked on, helpless to render assistance. When boats reached the spot, several men were taken out nearly drowned. Hurry calls for ambulances were sent out, and were responded to from this city and from Brooklyn. Police Captain Campbell of the 19th Precinct, Brooklyn, and Captain Rhodes of the 7th Precinct, Brooklyn, were soon on the scene with 20 men each. Hook and Ladder Company No. 6, Brooklyn, and the police reserves from the 5th, 6th, 14th, and 20th Brooklyn precincts arrived soon after. The Brooklyn ambulances were not needed, with the exception of the one from St. Catherine's, which carried to that hospital McAvoy and Tormey. The ambulance from this city brought back to St. John's Hospital Timothy Gannon. The bridge was built for the use of foot passengers alone, while the new iron drawbridge was being completed. It was about 200 feet long and had 2 draws, each side of the center abutment of the permanent bridge. The draws were each 35 feet in length. They worked on a swivel at the shore ends and were operated by pulleys and ropes. There was a large framework over each draw to take off the strain when they were being opened. The temporary bridge was built a year ago last September and was considered perfectly safe. It was in charge of Daniel Hickey, who had 5 assistants. The busiest hour on the bridge was between 5 and 6 o'clock, when the employees of the factories in the neighborhood stopped work. A majority of them live in Brooklyn, and had to cross the bridge as it was the only means of crossing to Brooklyn between this city and the bridge across the creek at Grand Street. Whenever a draw was open in the busy time, a large crowd would gather on the bridge waiting to cross. The men were always in a hurry and would push and crowd close up to the ends of the bridge so as to lose no time when the draw should close. 3 of the bridge keeper Hinkey's men opened the draw on the Brooklyn side about 5 o'clock to let a schooner through bound down the creek. It was low tide, and the tug having the schooner in tow had a hard time getting the boat through the draw. While that was going on, the bridge on the Laurel Hill side became jammed full of struggling men, each anxious to get near the frail gate across the end so as to be first over when the draw closed. Suddenly there was a loud cracking sound, and the men standing on the draw that was closed felt it sinking beneath them. Some of the men near the shore end of the draw cried, "The bridge is going down! The bridge is going down!" And a few managed to force the crowd on the permanent part of the structure back sufficiently to enable them to jump off. Then there followed a crash, and the draw broke in two in the center and fell into the water. The men fell in the shape of a wedge. Those that went down first were forced to the bottom of the creek. The men were so close in the water that it was almost impossible for those in the center of the struggling mass to save themselves. Some fought their way clear and swam ashore, while others grasped the wreckage of the draw and climbed upon it. The wreck floated, and to this more than anything else was due the escape of a majority of those in the water. A great many of the men on shore appeared to be paralyzed and made no effort to help the unfortunate fellows in the water. There were no small boats close at hand, and the only assistance the men overboard received from the shore was given by the aid of ropes thrown out. Several spectators dashed into the creek and dragged out men who had reached the bank and were too exhausted to help themselves further. Finally, one rickety small boat came from the Queens County Oil Works a short distance below the scene of the disaster. Thomas Dobbins of Meeker Avenue was in the boat, and he alone succeeded in hauling out 4 men who were about ready to give up the struggle and sink. The crews of 3 tugboats stuck in the mud a short way up the creek were powerless to render any assistance. The captain of the schooner that was stuck in the draw proved himself a hero. He saved at least a dozen men. A reporter for the New York Times tried to get the captain's name, but his vessel had gone on down the creek, and no one could be found who knew either the name of the schooner or that of her commander. As fast as the men got ashore, they were hurried into Toner's Penny Bridge Hotel, and were dosed by stimulants by ambulance surgeons from St. Catherine's, the Long Island, and the homeopathic hospitals Brooklyn and St. John's Hospital this city. Their clothing was stripped off and dried at the stoves in the barroom and dining room. By the time the police and firemen reached the spot, no more men could be seen in the water. Boats were procured, and the work of dragging the bottom with pikes and grappling irons was begun. The creek was dragged for several hundred feet, but no bodies were brought up. The search was, however, kept up until 8:30 o'clock. There were many thrilling escapes. Men were found who could not tell how they got on shore. They only knew they were back on dry land and were very thankful for it. Stephen Kennedy of 12 Fillmore Place, Brooklyn, was one of the men in the center of the draw when it went down. He said that there were at least 100 men on the draw when it fell. A majority of them went down into the water head first, and all struck in a heap. He was forced to the bottom of the creek a depth of 9 feet. He felt a load of men on top of him, but managed to wriggle clear. He caught hold of the wreckage and held on until the wind pushed it around, when he was able to wade ashore. Kennedy said that he saw several men sink under the water and does not believe that they ever came to the surface again. Peter Germain of 55 North 10th Street, Brooklyn, was one of the men rescued by Thomas Dobbins. He was in the middle of the draw when it fell. He tumbled over several times before he struck the water. He was very much exhausted from his struggle to free himself from the tangle of men. Thomas Higgins of 46 Meeker Avenue and John Kerrigan of 172 First Street, Brooklyn, Both had narrow escapes. They were with the crowd in the center of the draw. They say there were several loud cracking sounds before the bridge broke, and the next thing they knew, they were struggling in the water. William Fagan and Patrick McNamara, living on the corner of Meeker and Kingsland Avenue, Brooklyn, both had narrow escapes, and McNamara was struck on the head by a piece of timber. Both went under the water and were exhausted when they reached the surface again. Fagan hung onto his companion and managed to get him ashore. Joseph Gross of 145 Drakes Avenue, Brooklyn, managed to get hold of a plank and with its aid got back to land. He said that he was underwater some time. He is one of the men who saw George Mills go down and is certain that Mills did not come to the surface again. M. J. Ahern, 173 Meeker Avenue, Brooklyn, after striking the water, seized a guy rope. Then something struck him in the ear, and he found it was a log. Seizing that, he worked his way ashore. He says that when near the shore, he saw the two men sink, and is certain they did not come up again. Bridgekeeper Hickey said that he was on the Laurel hillside at the time of the accident. He saw the crowd gathering on the draw, but thought nothing of it, as the men would crowd on the bridge at night, notwithstanding repeated warnings not to do so. He said that the draw was overcrowded, and that was what caused it to give way. He could not account for the timbers breaking in the center, as he considered them sufficiently strong to hold any weight. The wrecked draw had not been opened in 3 weeks, as pile drivers were at work on the side, preparing a foundation for one of the anchorages for the new bridge. There were between 400 and 500 men standing around on the shore, waiting to get over. When the accident occurred, Mr. Hickey said, "The broken draw did not sink, and he believed that was the means of saving many lives, as most of the men in the water clung to it. He did not believe anyone was drowned, as the men were really not 10 feet from shore after striking the water. Many men, he declared, were picked up by a passing tugboat, while others either swam or waded ashore. The men who went down with the bridge were all employees of the Reed Fertilizer Works, Haberman Tin Works, Queens County Oil Works, Laurel Hill Chemical Works, Preston Fertilizer Works, and Fleischmann's Distillery." At St. Catherine's Hospital, it was said last night that when Tormey was fished out of the water, he was suffering so severely from shock that his death was momentarily expected. He was taken to a liquor saloon and was attended there by Assistant House Surgeon William O'Brien and Ambulance Surgeon J.E. Full of St. Catherine's Hospital, who went with the ambulance from that hospital, which is situated at Bushwick Avenue and 10 Ike Street. When he was placed in the ambulance, he was so weak that it was not thought he would reach the hospital alive. He was tenderly cared for by the Sisters of Charity at the hospital and was still alive last night, but it is feared that his internal injuries are so serious that it is impossible for him to recover. After he had somewhat recovered from the shock, he made the following statement: "The bridge swayed from side to side as we were crossing it. As it swayed over to one side, the crowd rushed to the opposite side, and then the bridge toppled over and gave way, throwing all the men into the water. I became unconscious and did not recover my senses until I had been dragged out of the water and carried into a liquor store." The other man was taken to St. Catherine's. McAvoy came from Lowell, Massachusetts about 6 months ago, and since that time he has been employed in the works of the Nicholas Chemical Company. When brought to the hospital, he was suffering greatly from shock. He is a very powerful man, 6 feet 2 inches tall, and weighs over 200 pounds. His robust constitution is in his favor, and he will probably recover. He has a sister, Mrs. Sarah Rock, who lives at 9 Somerset Street, Lowell. He was in company with Forney when the accident happened and tells the same story. The hurry call to the homeopathic hospital in Cumberland Street called an ambulance from that hospital to the scene, and with it were House Surgeon Clinton Willis and Dr. J. Morgan Smith. When the ambulance arrived at the scene of the disaster, the 2 physicians treated 9 men who had been fished out of the water, and then, with 3 policemen, started out in a rowboat to render assistance to anyone they might find in the water. Their rowboat was almost swamped by another boat, and Sergeant Willis was thrown down and had his left ankle badly sprained and bruised. Monday, January 15, 1894, the New York Tribune. Still finding bodies. 2 more victims of the Penny Bridge accident brought to the surface. Divers to be set at work. Gallant Annie Foley seriously ill. A boatload of sightseers capsized. 2 more bodies were removed yesterday from the black water of Newtown Creek and the broken timbers of the flimsy drawbridge which collapsed on Friday night, precipitating nearly 100 men into the water. The bodies brought to the surface yesterday by the grapnel were those of John Cook, 33 years old, of number 217 India Street, and August Bloom, 30 years old, of number 199 Hughes Street. Both men were employed in the Laurel Hill Chemical Works and had only found employment there on Thursday, after being in idleness for several weeks. This makes 4 bodies recovered since the accident, and it is believed that other bodies will be found. Those who were reported missing on Saturday have not as yet returned to their homes, and it is the general belief now that they are at the bottom of the creek. Whether they met death by drowning or were killed by the falling timbers when the bridge collapsed is yet to be learned. The number still missing, as reported to the police, is 5. John Toomey, of number 164 Eckford Street, who was taken to St. Catherine's Hospital suffering from a broken leg and shock, was reported last night to be in a precarious condition. He has contracted pneumonia, and it is said the chances of his recovery are slim. Hundreds of people remained about the scene of the accident yesterday, from early morning until long after dark, when the searchers abandoned their work for the day. The greater portion of the crowd were on the Queens County side of the creek, where the 4 bodies were found. Although the searchers began their labors at daylight, it was not until 2:30 o'clock that the first body was recovered. It was that of Cook. The tin pail in which the unfortunate man carried his dinner was still in his arm. The wife of Cook was the first to arrive at the creek yesterday morning while it was still dark. The anxiety of the woman was pitiful in the extreme, and when she saw the body of her husband, she was overcome with grief. The body was removed to the Long Island City morgue, and Mrs. Cook was assisted to her home, number 217 India Street, by some of her neighbors who had accompanied her to the scene. The Boston Globe covered the disaster as well, including Toners Hotels Hospitality and Compassion. Saturday, January 13, 1894, the Boston Globe. Into a creek. 60 men drop with a frail bridge, 5 missing and more injured. Factory hands were bound home. Crowded fast upon shaky structure, pitched headlong into the waters below. Only 1 boat to help drowning men. Search for lost continued by light of torches. New York, January 12. By the collapse of a section of an improvised drawbridge that spanned the Newtown Creek between Bradley Avenue and Laurel Hill on the Queens County side and Meeker Avenue, known as Penny Bridge, about 60 men were thrown down 12 feet tonight into the waters below. At the latest reports, 5 of the men are said to be missing and several were injured. It was shutting down time in the many factories that line the Queens County side of the creek when the accident occurred, and an army of workmen started for their homes in Brooklyn. Despite the protests of bridgekeeper Daniel Hickey, they jammed the frail structure until it swayed in the northeast gale that was sweeping across the creek. They could not cross because the draw in the Kings County part of the bridge was open. Struggling on the shore were between 200 and 300 more, who were all bent on getting on the draw at the same time when suddenly, without warning of any kind, the draw parted in the middle. Head first, the struggling crowd were pitched down on top of each other into the water. Shouts and cries of distress arose above the gale. Frantic efforts were made by some to grasp the wreckage, but soon the whole crowd was buried beneath the surface of the water. About the same instant, they all came up again and began squirming about like so many eels. It was low tide, and they were not 20 feet from shore when the bridge gave way. As they came puffing to the surface, they secured hold of pieces of the broken structure, which settled slowly down on top of them. Others who regained their presence of mind struck out for the shore. On the Queens County shore, waiting their turn to cross the draw, were between 300 and 400 of their fellow workmen. There was but one rowboat in the vicinity, while on the opposite side of the draw, two tugboats with their tows were stuck fast in the mud, waiting a rise of the tide, and were consequently unable to render aid. But the solitary rowboat was pressed into service, while the crowd of workmen along the shore waded in, and with poles and ropes aided the struggling crowd in the water to reach shore. A schooner that was going up the creek at the time also rendered effective service. The captain launched a boat and succeeded in picking up 7 of the unfortunates. Quite a gang were gathered in by a tug that came puffing up the creek and were landed on the Brooklyn side. The greater number, however, clung to the shattered bridge, which served as a raft, and were towed to the Queens County side, where the greater number were landed. Toner's Penny Bridge Hotel is located on the Queens County shore, where the rescued men were taken, coated with ice. Toner opened up and gave the shivering crowd the free use of his place. He also placed refreshments and clothing at their disposal. As fast as the men came in, they were stripped and their clothing wrung out. Soon the floor of the hotel was swimming with water. Clothing was hung up on all sides to dry, and constant additions were made to the throng as the half-frozen men were fished out and hustled into the place. Ambulance calls were sent out in Brooklyn and Long Island City, and soon both sides of the creek were lined with ambulances from different hospitals with their surgeons. They could render little aid beyond helping to restore several of the unfortunates, who were fished out half-frozen and half-drowned. Long after the last workman clambered up the bank from the creek, covered with mud and his clothing freezing to his body, the search of the waters was continued. Bridgekeeper Hickey, who was on the scene when the accident occurred, superintended the work of rescue. Those on the shore say the bridge went down in the form of the letter U, and the crowd was just rolled on top of each other as if they were tumbling downhill. Stephen Kennedy of 12 Freeman Street, Brooklyn, one of the rescued men, said he was in the center of the structure when it broke. The other men fell on him in a heap, and he felt himself strike the bottom of the creek. When he rose to the surface, the bridge settled on top of him, and he was once more forced under water. On coming up the second time, however, he managed to catch hold of a piece of floating timber, to which he clung until drawn ashore and taken into Toner's Hotel. Peter Germain of 55 North 10th Street, Brooklyn, went down with the crowd, and on coming to the surface was picked up by the rowboat. J. Ahern of 173 Meeker Ave said that on coming to the surface, he was struck by a falling piece of timber. He caught hold of it when his hands became coated with ice. He then laid his weight on the stick and was carried into the shore by the tide and wind. John Kerrigan of 172 First Street, Brooklyn, was also carried under by the wreckage, but was rescued by men from the shore. Long after the last man was drawn from the water, the search was continued by torchlight in the darkness, but no more unfortunates were found. All but the 5 men whose names are given were accounted for, and their fellows do not know whether they perished or were picked up by some passing boat and got away in the confusion. Bridgekeeper Hickey is positive no one was drowned. He was on the scene of the accident from the time of its occurrence until late tonight. He attributes the accident to the overcrowding of the bridge. He said it was impossible to keep the men back. The structure on which the accident occurred was an improvised footbridge, and a new iron one has been building for which it was a substitute, which will be ready for use in a month. The footbridge was of wood, about 4 1/2 feet wide. It was built in sections of 35 feet each. The section on which the accident occurred stretched from the Queens County shore to the center of the stream, where it rested on the abutment on which the big bridge is to turn. From this point, the other section was continued, thus forming the link between the two shores. Each section was so arranged that it could be swung around as a draw. When the crowd piled on the section leading from the Queens County shore, the section connecting the center abutment with the Brooklyn shore was open to let a tug with a schooner in tow through. It was dark at the time, and the crowd from the factories, not seeing what was delaying those ahead of them, kept pushing on until the frail structure sank beneath its load. It was low tide, and the gale had carried considerable of the water out of the creek. Bridgekeeper Hickey estimates that there was about 9 feet of water in the draw at the time of the accident. It is probably due to this fact and the nearness to the shore that so few are missing. The bridge keeper is also of the opinion that the men reported missing will turn up all right. The papers mention Toner's Penny Bridge Hotel being used as a sort of community space for people waiting to hear of their loved one's fate, as well as a place for the wet and cold survivors to recover around a roaring fire. On January 14, the Sun reported in a typical scene that a brother and sister of Bernard Boyle remained at Toner's Hotel on the Queens County side all day yesterday in the hope that his body would be found. They were still there last night. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle's article from January 13 describes the scene with quotes from a survivor. Thomas Kavanaugh of 146 Driggs Avenue, Brooklyn, was almost drowned. He was taken to Toner's Hotel near Calvary Cemetery, where he told the following story of the accident. The responsibility for the accident, he said, is equally divided between the people themselves and the bridge keepers Flaherty, Ripper, and Hickey. The people crowded each other to go on the bridge, and the bridge keepers were foolish enough to open the gates and let them pass through. Fortunately, there were no women in the crowd. If there had been, most of them would have been drowned. There are a number of women employed in Haberman's tin factory, but they had left the place about an hour before. The only thing I can remember about the breaking of the bridge is that when I stepped out on it, it fell asunder and I fell with it into the water. Then the real struggle commenced for the possession of a plank which someone threw into the water to us. 5 of us clung to that plank, and no sooner would we get on top than the others would draw us underneath. Finally, I was pulled ashore by a fellow workman named Patrick Duffy, who, in his efforts to save me, cut both his legs badly. Michael J. Ahern of 172 Meeker Avenue, one of the rescued men, said that the tugboats gave no assistance whatever. He said that but for the timely arrival of men who were employed in Calvary Cemetery, a score or more of men would have lost their lives. The break occurred directly in the center of, or about 25 feet from the Queens County side. This accounts for all those who were thrown into the water being rescued on the Queens County shore. The draw is made of timbers running lengthwise. The timbers are braced to each other. They are 3 inches thick and 9 inches deep. There are 3 of these stringers, and they are supported by wire cables running from the top of the derrick. There are 8 of the cable wires. They hold up the span, which works in the center of the derrick and is swung by block and fall. The flooring of the draw consists of 2-inch spruce planks. There are about 200 of these planks. Dean and Westbrook of New York have the contract for the work. Their contract stipulates they should build a temporary drawbridge with all guarantees of its safety until the new bridge should be accepted by both counties. The work was commenced September 1, 1892. The contractors promised to have it completed in 6 months. The abutment on the Queens County side of the structure is nearly completed, and the superintendent is sanguine of the new bridge being ready for use by March 1. It is at the foot of Meeker Avenue, Williamsburg, and about 150 feet from the entrance to Calvary Cemetery on the Queens County side. Innumerable complaints have been made by the businessmen and property owners on both sides of the bridge about the slow manner in which the work has been done. There are 6 bridge keepers detailed for duty there, 3 during the day and 3 at night. Those on duty at the time of the accident were Daniel Hickey, John Flaherty, and William Ripper. Hickey says that he repeatedly cautioned the men not to crowd each other on the draw, but it was no use. The Penny Bridge, as it has long been called, is under the general supervision of a bridge tender, employed in common by the authorities of Kings and Queens counties, which it connects. For many years, there have been annual discussions in the Board of Supervisors in the 2 counties concerning their respective rights regarding its management and maintenance. 2 years before the Penny Bridge disaster of 1894, the Times-Union reported on Michael Toner's health, the way he or his business's social media might have posted it nowadays. January 28, 1892. Looking for health in the South. Michael Toner, proprietor of Toner's Hotel, Penny Bridge, started on a 4 weeks tour on Monday. during which time all the principal places in Washington, Maryland, Virginia, and the Carolinas will be visited. Mr. Toner, whose health has been undermined of late, is accompanied by his wife, and it is for the purpose of regaining his former health that the trip is being made. But it did only so much good, and Michael Toner passed away on September 5, 1895. The name of his hotel lived on, however, briefly, it seems. The Brooklyn Citizen reported on April 27, 1908, Toner's Hotel opened, seemingly at the same spot as the previous hotel, described as being in Long Island City at Calvary Cemetery, with a new proprietor named Lon Martins. The Citizen describes the new hotel as a resort which will put in the shade both recent and remote endeavors of restaurateurs to properly cater to the demands of the hungry and thirsty, and as a new palace of gastronomical delights that will pay particular attention to funeral parties. Perhaps funerals at Skelton's Morgue in Elmhurst, a place we have covered elsewhere. This laudatory article closes, "It was the verdict of all the guests that the place under the new management is unrivaled by any of the most pretentious in the borough." So a burn on other hotels, and on Michael Toner? For exclusive extra episodes and content, including images from many of these stories, plus additional stories and other stuff we found in creating this podcast, support us on Patreon, link in the description. Our zine using these and similar materials about Newtown Creek and Greenpoint is available at Blue Stockings in New York City or on our website, explodingbrooklyn.com. All music by Charity Case, charitycasemusic.com, unless noted in the episode notes. Also available on explodingbrooklyn.com is Boulevard Years, The Greenpoint Oil Spill, the first novel atop the spill.